My grandfather lived by the forest his entire life. Not next to it, with it. That's how he used to say it, as if the forest were a neighbor, not a place. When I was a child, he took me for walks only up to a certain point. We always stopped by an old drainage ditch where the ground sank under our boots and the trees grew thicker than anywhere else. Beyond that point, we never went. "You don't answer in there," he said quietly, "even if someone calls you." I thought he meant echoes or animals. A child's mind prefers simple explanations. Once, I asked him directly why we were never allowed to answer. He stopped, rested his hand against a pine trunk, and stared into the forest as if something inside it was listening. "Because whatever calls you learns your voice," he said, "and once it learns it, it stops calling." I laughed back then. I remember that clearly. He didn't smile. In the evenings when we sat at the kitchen table, he told stories about people who vanished in the forest. He always began the same way. They had only stepped out for a moment, for firewood, for the dog, to check a noise. And he always ended with one sentence, spoken almost in a whisper. They answered. After his death, the house stood empty for a long time. The forest kept growing, closer, quieter. When I finally returned as an adult, the neighbors said it was good to see lights in the windows again. On the first night, I woke to a sound coming from beyond the trees. Someone was calling my name, in a voice that sounded exactly like my grandfather. I sat up in bed as if struck in the chest. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The room was silent, too silent for a house standing right next to a forest. No crickets, no wind. Even the old floorboards refused to creak. "Come on," the voice said again. It wasn't coming from far away. It sounded like someone standing just beyond the tree line, exactly where my grandfather had never allowed me to go. I knew that tone, the slight rasp, the way the vowels stretched when he was tired. My mind instantly supplied an image, my grandfather leaning on his cane, calling me in for dinner. But something was wrong. He always said my name once, never more. Now the voice repeated it again and again with the same calm intonation, like a recording stuck on a loop. No impatience, no emotion, as if it were checking whether I still remembered who it was supposed to be. I got up and walked to the window. The curtain trembled slightly, though the air in the room was completely still. I pulled it aside slowly. The forest was a solid wall of black, not individual trees, a single mass. The boundary between the yard and the woods looked different at night, as if the trees had taken one step forward. "Don't just stand there," the voice said. "It's cold." For a fraction of a second I wanted to answer, just one word, anything, even wait. Then I remembered my grandfather's hand tightening around mine when I was a child. "Never say anything," he used to repeat. "Not hello, not who's there. The forest doesn't ask, it tests." I stepped back from the window and sat on the bed, pressing my hands over my ears. The voice kept calling for a while, growing quieter, as if moving deeper into the trees. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was so deep, I could hear my own breathing, and something else, soft, careful footsteps, as if something were learning how to walk on two legs. I didn't sleep again until morning. I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the paint. Even though I had promised myself I wouldn't count anything, my grandfather always said the forest liked numbers because numbers were orderly, and it hated order. When dawn finally came, the silence loosened its grip. A dog barked somewhere down the road. A car passed in the distance. The world slipped back into place as if the night had been nothing more than a bad dream. I stepped outside with a mug of hot coffee, moving carefully, as if the ground itself might react. The air was heavy and damp. The yard looked almost normal. Almost. There were marks in the soil that hadn't been there the day before. They weren't animal tracks. Too large for a deer, too narrow for a boar, and too deliberate, as if whoever made them had been concentrating, learning how to place their feet. The tracks led straight to the drainage ditch, to the boundary. I crouched and pressed my fingers into one of the impressions. The mud was still soft, fresh, too fresh to be dismissed as imagination. "Don't go any farther." I flinched. My neighbor stood by the fence. I hadn't heard him approach. He was an older man, one I remembered from childhood, and he was staring at the forest with the same tight expression my grandfather used to wear. "Did it call you?" he asked bluntly. I hesitated, then nodded. He spat into the dirt and crossed himself slowly. "Good thing you didn't answer," he muttered, "because once you do, it stops pretending." I asked him what it was. He looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing whether the truth would do more harm than silence. "The forest," he said finally, "or what the forest left behind to decide who belongs here." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me alone at the boundary. That was when I heard it again, not a call. This time it was a whisper right beside my ear, even though I was standing alone in the open yard. "Now you know what your voice sounds like." I took a step back, then another. The whisper didn't return, but I felt something shift inside the forest, as if it had noticed my movement. The trees didn't sway, yet the space between them seemed to tighten. I went back inside and locked every door. It was irrational, I knew that, but my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down on the hallway floor just to steady myself. In the old cupboard, in a drawer no one had opened in years, I found my grandfather's notebook. It had no cover, no title, just yellowed pages filled with his uneven handwriting. They weren't stories, they were rules. The first said that you must never answer a call, even if it sounds like someone you love. The second warned never to walk toward the voice, even if you are already standing at the boundary. The third said, never try to see what is calling, because looking meant wanting to understand. Each rule after that was shorter, more frantic. The handwriting grew thinner, less controlled, as if the hand writing it had been losing strength. On the final page, written in a different shade of ink, there was a single sentence. If it starts using your words, it means it is already close. A floorboard creaked on the porch. Someone was walking there slowly, dragging their steps, as if testing whether the wood would hold their weight. They stopped directly in front of the door. "You don't have to say anything," my grandfather's voice said gently. "I already know you can hear me." For the first time, it wasn't calling my name. For the first time, it was speaking to me. I stood frozen on the other side of the door, my grandfather's notebook pressed tightly against my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to answer, not with words, but with reflex, the way you respond to your name before you even think. "You were always stubborn," the voice said softly, "just like me." It was perfect. Even the pauses between words were right. If someone had recorded it and played it back later, I would have sworn it was an old memory echoing through the house. The porch creaked again. One slow step, then another. They stopped so close to the door that I could almost feel a presence through the wood. "Don't you want to ask how I know what you're thinking?" I clenched my jaw. In the notebook, I found another rule, scribbled in the margin almost as an afterthought. It will try to start a conversation. Silence is the only answer it cannot imitate. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing. Slow, even, the way my grandfather had taught me when thunderstorms terrified me as a child. A moment passed, then another. "This won't help," the voice whispered. "You already called me once, a long time ago." My heart nearly stopped. A memory surfaced, me as a child standing by the ditch, a shadow between the trees, fear tightening my throat so suddenly that I shouted my grandfather's name without thinking. He had grabbed my hand instantly, too late or just in time. "That's when I learned," the voice continued. "Now I'm just checking if you remember." Something slid beneath the door, a shadow, too long, too thin, not shaped like anything that should cast one. That was when I understood. This wasn't waiting, it was teaching. The shadow beneath the door slowly withdrew, as if whatever cast it was still figuring out how to move without being noticed. The porch fell silent. I stood there for a long time, listening, until my legs started to ache and the fear dulled into something heavier. When I finally moved, the house felt wrong. Not hostile, just attentive. I opened my grandfather's notebook again. On the last written page, the ink was smeared as if rain or sweat had soaked into the paper. "If it leaves, it doesn't mean it's gone. It always leaves a mark. The mark is an invitation." I didn't understand until I stepped outside. On the porch, directly in front of the door, there was a smear of dark mud. Not a footprint, more like a drag, as if fingers had been pulled slowly across the wood, testing the surface. The mud smelled of rot and wet leaves, the same as by the ditch. The forest was quiet, not empty, watchful. Then I saw something else. At the edge of the yard, right at the boundary, sticks had been arranged in a straight line. They hadn't been there before. They formed a crude arrow, pointing deeper into the trees. I flipped through the notebook, my hands trembling, until another note fell out, a loose scrap of paper. When it starts showing you the way, it has already chosen. I stood there for a long time, staring at the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw a shape among the trunks, something too still, too tall, blending perfectly into the vertical lines of the trees. It didn't call, it didn't have to, because it knew I was looking. I don't know how long I stood at the boundary. The sun shifted overhead, shadows changed direction, but the forest remained the same, as if time slowed the closer you got to it. The arrow of sticks was still there. If anything, it looked corrected. One of the branches had been moved slightly, aligning the shape into something too precise. My grandfather used to say the forest never makes straight lines unless it's copying someone. I went back inside to grab my jacket. As I put it on, I realized I was moving exactly the way he used to. The same hook, the same adjustment of the cuff, as if my body remembered something my mind refused to accept. I left the notebook on the table. I didn't want to bring it with me. I was afraid that if I crossed the boundary holding the rules, they would stop applying. The first step was the hardest. The ground beyond the ditch was soft, but stable. Nothing happened. No sound, no whisper, just the smell of damp earth and old bark. The second step changed everything. The forest didn't move. It noticed the sensation wasn't visual or auditory, it was a tension. A sudden, heavy focus like eyes snapping into place. The space between the trees seemed to thicken, pressing inward. "Good," my grandfather's voice said, not from behind me, but from everywhere at once. "That's how it starts." I stopped. I didn't answer, not even in my thoughts. That was when I realized the truth. It never wanted me to enter the forest. It wanted me to choose to. A path formed without ever appearing, not a trail, a lack of resistance. Branches didn't snag my clothes. Roots didn't trip my feet. The forest parted only where I stepped, then closed again the moment I passed. When I glanced to the side, the undergrowth was impenetrable. That was when I felt it. I wasn't alone, not behind me, not ahead of me, beside me. Something moved at the same pace, always just to my left, always one step deeper into the trees. When I slowed, it slowed. When I stopped, it stopped with me. I couldn't hear footsteps. I could hear silence moving. "Don't look," my grandfather's real voice echoed in my memory. "If you look, you admit you want to see more." I shut my eyes and kept walking. I counted my breaths instead of my steps. My breath was mine. My steps no longer felt like they were. The forest began to change. The trees grew older, thicker, their bark split like dried skin. On some trunks, I saw marks, old cuts at a familiar height. I recognized them immediately, my grandfather's marks. He always carved them in the same place, always the same way, which meant one thing. Someone had come back this way. A sudden warmth brushed my shoulder, like breath, like presence close enough that leaning an inch would make contact. "You know how to walk now," the voice said. It wasn't my grandfather's, it was mine. I didn't answer, but the forest shuddered slightly, as if it accepted that as enough. We reached a clearing that didn't feel open at all. The trees stood farther apart, but they leaned inward as if listening. The ground was packed hard and bare, stripped of leaves, like the floor of an old room. I knew this place. My grandfather had brought me here once long ago. He made me close my eyes and count my breaths. When I opened them, he was already leading me away. He never let me look. Now, I didn't have to. In the center of the clearing stood an old tree stump, its surface scarred with deep axe marks. I had seen those marks before, on my grandfather's hands. The scars followed the same pattern. "This is where they learn," the voice said. It no longer belonged to anyone in particular. This is where things are left behind. The silence beside me shifted. Something pressed gently against my shoulder, like a hand testing whether I was real. My skin prickled, but there was no pain. Not yet. That's when I understood what the mark truly was. Not mud, not sticks. Memory. Everyone who came here left something behind. A voice, a movement, a habit. The forest collected them patiently until it could assemble something that could walk, speak, and call. He was here too, the voice whispered. Your grandfather? I closed my eyes. I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it. Silence was the only shield I had left. Something retreated, reluctantly, like a disappointed student denied a final lesson. The forest exhaled, a low sound that felt almost like relief. But I knew this wasn't an ending. It was a postponement. The way back wasn't the same. The forest no longer parted for me. Branches scraped my jacket. Roots pushed up where they hadn't been before. The path unraveled behind me, closing itself step by step, as if erasing evidence of my passage. The silence beside me lagged now. It stayed behind. I felt it like a stretched wire, tension pulling at my back. The closer I got to the boundary, the heavier each step became. The forest didn't want to let me go, but it no longer had the right to stop me. Not yet. Something whispered from deep among the trees, its voice layered with many others. You'll learn more. I didn't answer. When the drainage ditch finally came into view, relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. I crossed the boundary in a single step, without hesitation, without looking back. Only then did I turn. The forest stood still, ordinary, quiet, as if nothing had happened. The yard was clean, no sticks, no mud. Even the porch looked freshly washed. Inside the house, my grandfather's notebook lay where I had left it, open. A new sentence had appeared on the last page, written in fresh ink that smelled faintly unfamiliar. If you came back and nothing has changed, it means you are the one who did. I closed the notebook. That night, I slept without dreams for the first time since returning. But when I woke before dawn, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The forest remembered me now. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. The village returned to its routine as if nothing had happened. My neighbor waved from across the fence. The mailman left letters on the porch. The forest stood still. That silence was worse than the calling. I began noticing changes in myself, small things, easy to dismiss. I adjusted my jacket cuffs the way my grandfather used to. When someone called my name, I froze instead of answering, my breath caught in my throat before I could stop it. Nights were the hardest. The voice never returned. Instead, something subtler took its place. An echo, not of sound, but of intent. Thoughts that felt finished before I finished thinking them, as if the forest already knew where they were going. One night, I woke up standing by the window. I didn't remember getting out of bed. The curtain was pulled aside. I was staring into the dark space between the trees, feeling no fear at all, only familiarity, like standing in a place that had always belonged to me, and I had only forgotten it for a while. Behind me, a whisper rose, not from the forest, from my own mouth. Don't answer. I stepped back sharply, my heel hitting the bed frame. The moment my hand touched the mattress, something inside me snapped, a thin thread pulling me toward the night. In the morning, I found fingerprints on the window pane, clean ones, as if someone had pressed their hand there just to feel the cold glass. The notebook lay open on the table. A new line had been added. When you start warning yourself, it means it already knows how to come back. I finally understood. The forest no longer needed my voice. It only needed my silence. The last night came without warning. There was no calling, no whispering, no footsteps on the porch. The forest stood utterly still, as if holding its breath along with me. I sat at the kitchen table exactly where my grandfather used to sit. The notebook lay closed in front of me. I didn't need to open it anymore. I knew every rule by heart. I finally understood why my grandfather had never tried to flee, never tried to destroy the forest. The forest wasn't the danger. What mattered was what remained after someone learned to listen. He hadn't been guarding the boundary from the forest. He had been guarding people from themselves. Just before dawn, I stepped onto the porch. At the edge of the yard, leaning against a pine tree, stood a figure. I didn't look at its face. I didn't need to. It had my posture, my height, the same small habit of shifting weight from one foot to the other. "You know now," it said, in a voice that was both mine and not mine. "Now you'll teach." I didn't answer. I turned and went back inside, closing the door calmly behind me. There were no footsteps following me. The forest didn't need anything more. I still live here. People sometimes ask why I don't sell the house, why I never leave. I smile and change the subject. And when children from the village play too close to the drainage ditch, I always tell them the same thing. If someone calls you from the forest, I pause. I look at the trees, and I finish the sentence exactly the way my grandfather once did. Never answer.